It was the autumn of 1453. 6 months had passed since Constantinople, the heart of Byzantium, fell to the Ottoman armies. The city that had once called itself the New Rome now echoed with the sound of foreign prayers and foreign soldiers. Beyond the burning ruins and the broken churches, a quiet hill above Thessaloniki still held a flicker of the old world. A small convent of stone and silence, the convent of Theotokos. The morning mist had not yet lifted when a lone rider appeared on the narrow path leading up the mountain. His horse was exhausted, its flanks streaked with sweat and dust. The rider carried a single object wrapped in linen, a sealed letter marked with the insignia of the Patriarch of Constantinople. He dismounted at the convent gate, his eyes hollow from weeks on the road. When the gatekeeper nun opened the door, he whispered, "I bring word from what remains of the holy city." Inside, the air smelled of beeswax and cold stone. The convent had stood for nearly 100 years, built by noble families who believed their daughters could serve God better away from the world's corruption. Now the world had found them anyway. Sister Theodora, the abbess, took the letter to the small chapel. She was a woman of 60, her back straight despite years of fasting and prayer. The candlelight flickered across her weathered face as she broke the red wax seal. The parchment trembled slightly in her hands. The message was short. It warned that Ottoman forces were moving west. Every monastery, every convent, every church that still flew the Byzantium cross was to be occupied. The Patriarch's words were clear. Evacuate, scatter, flee to your families or to the west, to Rome, to Venice, if there is still time. But the last line chilled her more than all the rest. It read, "What follows is not martyrdom in the old sense. It is something else, something that takes longer, something that leaves you alive." She read the words again, her lips moving soundlessly. Around her the candles hissed in their holders. The faces of painted saints watched her from the walls, silent witnesses to the collapse of everything they represented. She did not share that last sentence with her sisters. Instead, she gathered the 37 women in the chapel that night. Some were in their 20s, some near the end of their lives. All of them wore the same plain black veil, the same wooden cross around their necks. When Theodora read the letter aloud, the younger sisters wept quietly. The older ones sat still, their faces unreadable. When she finished, she said simply, "We will vote, to stay or to go." The next morning, after prayers, each sister placed a small white pebble into one of 2 clay bowls, one marked with a cross for stay, one plain for leave. When the count was finished, 34 stones rested in the bowl marked with stay. Only 3, the youngest, chose to flee. Theodora gave the convent's last coins, a loaf of bread each, and her blessing. As they walked down the mountain path, the others stood at the gate, watching in silence. No one spoke the fear that hung in the air, that they might never see those 3 again. For 2 weeks, the convent remained untouched. The sisters prayed. They baked bread. They tended the gardens as if the world outside had not ended. But the horizon changed each night. Smoke rising where villages had once been. The faint thunder of distant hooves. Rumors reached them from travelers who dared the mountain road. Churches looted. Relics taken, priests hung from their own bells. On the 14th day, as dusk bled into the hills, the sound of drums began to echo through the valley. By morning, the Ottoman banners appeared, red and black against the rising sun. The convent bell rang once for morning prayer and then fell silent forever. When the soldiers arrived, they did not come in haste. They rode in formation, as if performing a ritual. The lead officer, a young man with eyes as sharp as the steel of his sword, dismounted and approached the gate. He called out in Greek, "Open, in the name of the Sultan." Theodora walked out to meet him, her veil fluttering in the cold wind. She carried no weapon, only the cross in her hand. When the gate opened, the officer bowed slightly, more from formality than respect. "I am Hassan ibn Murad. By the Sultan's decree, this property now belongs to the empire. You will remain here, under supervision, until new orders are given." Theodora replied calmly, "We are servants of God. We have no quarrel with your emperor." Hassan's gaze lingered on her face, then drifted toward the younger sisters clustered behind her. He nodded once and said, "Then pray. Pray for mercy." That night the soldiers took control of the convent. They set up tents in the courtyard and stationed guards by the chapel door. The sisters were ordered to remain within the walls. No one was harmed, not yet, but the air was heavy with dread. Theodora gathered the women and led them in prayer. Her voice did not tremble, but her heart did. She remembered the letter's final line, "It leaves you alive." She wondered what that meant and feared she was about to find out. Over the following days, more soldiers arrived, not raiders, but officials, men of the administration, scribes, interpreters, and one scholar wearing a turban embroidered with gold. He introduced himself as Emir Selim, an advisor to the governor of Thessaloniki. He carried a scroll listing every religious property in the region. When he spoke, his tone was courteous, almost gentle. He said, "You are under the protection of the Sultan. Your chapel will remain intact. Your prayers may continue, but your allegiance must change. You are no longer servants of Byzantium. You are subjects of the empire." Theodora bowed her head. "We have always served only God." Selim smiled faintly. "Then you will find he listens in every language." That night, the sisters lay awake in their cells, listening to the sound of boots outside. Some whispered prayers, others silently cried into their veils. None could sleep. They all knew, without needing to say it, that the walls that once kept sin out now kept fear in. The first sign of change came quietly. The soldiers demanded the removal of icons from the chapel walls. They said it was for preservation, that the images would be sent to the city for safekeeping, but none were ever returned. Theodora watched as the painted faces of saints disappeared, one by one, until the walls were bare and gray. Then came new rules. The sisters were ordered to attend instruction sessions led by Emir Selim. He explained in calm, logical tones the teachings of Islam. He quoted the Quran with precision of a scholar. He said the Sultan sought only understanding, not conversion. But when one sister, Maria, refused to attend, she was taken away for discipline. She returned 3 days later, her eyes empty, her voice gone. After that, no one refused. Within a month, the convent no longer looked like a Christian sanctuary. The cross atop the chapel was removed. The bells were silenced. Arabic calligraphy replaced the old Greek inscriptions. But the most painful change was invisible, the slow erosion of identity. The sisters were told they could keep their habits, but must abandon their names. Each was assigned a new one, drawn from a list: Layla, Fatima, Aisha, Zuleika, names that felt foreign on their tongues, yet they were forced to speak them aloud during roll call each morning. Theodora became Khadija. She repeated it softly, as though by saying it she could make it unreal. She still prayed to Christ in secret, whispering the ancient hymns beneath her breath when she was alone. But she knew eyes were watching. There were always eyes. The most devout among them, Sister Helena, tried to resist. She kept a small wooden cross hidden under her pillow. When a guard discovered it, he held it up in front of the others and asked, "Is this your God?" Helena answered, "It is the symbol of his love." The guard dropped it into the fire. Helena did not cry, but that night she disappeared. Her absence was never explained. The sisters were told she had been transferred to another convent in the city. But Theodora knew better. Every morning she looked at the empty place in the chapel and wondered how long before another seat went empty. The transformation of the convent continued with methodical precision. The gardens that once grew herbs for healing now produced food for the soldiers. The library was sealed off. Manuscripts were taken away to imperial archives. The nuns' duties were changed from prayer and teaching to weaving cloth for the Ottoman army. Each stitch they made was another thread binding them to their captors. Months passed. Seasons changed. The outside world forgot them, but they could not forget what they had been. They were still alive, just as the patriarch's letter had warned. But what lived inside them was no longer the same. The snows came early that winter. By November, the convent was buried under a white silence so thick that even the guards grew weary of shouting orders. The sisters worked in the weaving hall from dawn until dark, their fingers cracked and bleeding from cold. They wove coarse linen for army tents, dyed with cheap indigo. Each thread smelled faintly of smoke and sweat. Sister Theodora, once the abbess, now merely Khadija, moved among them like a shadow. Her back was still straight, but her eyes were distant, as if she were listening to voices that no one else could hear. Every night, after the guards finished their rounds, she would kneel on the icy stones of the chapel floor. There were no icons left, no candles, no sound but the whisper of the wind through the broken shutters. She prayed not for deliverance anymore, but for remembrance, that God would not forget them, even if the world did. The younger sisters clung to her presence. They had begun to forget the old hymns. Some had started using their new names without realizing it. And yet, in their dreams, they still heard the bells of Thessaloniki ringing, far away, in a city that no longer belonged to them. One evening, as dusk settled over the hills, a convoy of horses arrived at the gate. This time, the men who came were not soldiers. They wore silk robes and golden belts, their eyes lined with kohl. Among them was a tall man with a trimmed beard, his cloak edged with fur. He introduced himself as Mustafa Pasha, governor of the province. Behind him walked a scholar, historical narrator. The snows came early that winter. By November, the convent was buried under a white silence so thick that even the bards grew weary of shouting orders. The sisters worked in the weaving hall from dawn until dark, their fingers cracked and bleeding from cold. They wove coarse linen for army tents, dyed with cheap indigo. Each thread smelled faintly of smoke and sweat. Sister Theodora, once the abbess, now merely Khadija, moved among them like a shadow. Her back was still straight, but her eyes were distant, as if she were listening to voices that no one else could hear. Every night, after the guards finished their rounds, she would kneel on the icy stones of the chapel floor. There were no icons left, no candles, no sound but the whisper of the wind through the broken shutters. She prayed not for deliverance anymore, but for remembrance, that God would not forget them, even if the world did. The younger sisters clung to her presence. They had begun to forget the old hymns. Some had started using their new names without realizing it. And yet, in their dreams, they still heard the bells of Thessaloniki ringing, far away, in a city that no longer belonged to them. One evening, as dusk settled like ash over the hills, a convoy of horses arrived at the gate. This time, the men who came were not soldiers. They wore silk robes and golden belts, their eyes lined with kohl. Among them was a tall man with a trimmed beard, his cloak edged with fur. He introduced himself as Mustafa Pasha, governor of the province. Behind him walked a scholar carrying a chest bound in iron. Hassan ibn Murad, the same officer who had first taken the convent, knelt before him. The sisters watched from behind the cloistered arches, their hearts pounding. The Pasha's gaze moved slowly across their faces. He smiled faintly, then said in accented Greek, "So these are the holy women of Byzantium." No one answered. He gestured to the chest, and the scholar opened it. Inside lay rows of parchment scrolls, church registries, family records, baptism names. The Pasha pointed to them. He said, "These are the ghosts of your empire. Names, bloodlines, vows, all dust now. But the Sultan is merciful. He offers you new life under his protection." Theodora stepped forward. Her voice was calm but firm. "We already have life under God's protection." The Pasha's smile did not fade. He said, "Then may your God protect your silence." He turned and left, but the chest remained. Over the next days, the scrolls were burned in the courtyard. One by one, the sisters watched their names turn to smoke. After that day, the nature of their captivity changed. No longer was it merely control, but it became transformation. They were given new duties. A section of the convent was turned into a school for local girls, the daughters of Ottoman officials. The sisters were ordered to teach them embroidery, reading, and manners. It was said to be an act of mercy, a bridge between faiths. But to Theodora, it felt like something else, a slow erasure disguised as peace. The young Ottoman girls laughed freely, their voices echoing through the stone halls that once held chants and hymns. They called the sisters teacher, but rarely looked them in the eye. For every word of Greek the sisters spoke, they were corrected in Turkish. For every sign of the cross, they were reminded that there was now only one empire, one law, one truth. The sisters obeyed, but inside something began to change. Faith turned inward, private, hidden, like a candle cupped against the wind. They no longer needed icons to pray. Their faith had moved to the only place it could survive, the human heart. Sister Eleni, once the youngest, began secretly copying verses of scripture from memory onto scraps of cloth with thread. Each line was disguised as part of a pattern. A spiral of blue silk might hide a psalm. A cross of red thread concealed a prayer for the dead. When a guard asked her what the designs meant, she smiled and said, "They are flowers." But one night, her secret was discovered. A scrap of embroidered linen slipped from her sleeve as she worked. Hassan ibn Murad picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The pattern looked harmless, but the letters were there, faint but unmistakable. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death." He said nothing then, but the next morning, Eleni was gone. Her loom stood empty, the half-finished cloth folded neatly beside it. No one ever spoke her name again, not even Theodora. They all knew that speaking it might summon the same fate. Years passed. The world beyond the convent changed. Empires rose, wars began, alliances shifted. But within those walls, time stood still. Children grew into women, women into ghosts. The Ottomans no longer guarded them with swords, they guarded them with bureaucracy. A tax was placed on the convent's land, payable only in labor. The sisters worked themselves into sickness to meet the quota. Each death was recorded in a ledger, written not in Greek, but in Arabic script. Their language was fading, their songs were forgotten, but still, a spark of the old fire burned beneath the ashes. Then, one spring, something unexpected happened. A stranger appeared at the gate. He was neither soldier nor official, but a man in the robes of a physician. He claimed to be a servant of the Venetian traders who had returned to Thessaloniki under Ottoman permission. His name was Matteo di Rossi. He spoke Greek with a foreign accent and asked to see the abbess. Theodora met him in the old chapel. He bowed and said quietly, "I come with news. The West remembers you." She stared at him, hardly believing the words. He explained that reports of the convent's survival had reached Venice. Some monks in Crete were collecting testimonies of Christian captives. If she could write her story, he could smuggle it out, proof that Byzantium's faith had not been extinguished. For the first time in years, Theodora felt something like hope. But hope was dangerous. That night, she gathered the few sisters who still remembered how to write. By candlelight, they began their chronicle, not on parchment, but on cloth, using dye stolen from the weaving hall. They wrote names, prayers, and fragments of songs. They wrote not for rescue, but for memory. The chronicle was nearly finished when the soldiers returned. A new commander had taken Hassan's place, younger, more ambitious, less patient. He ordered a complete inspection of the convent. When he found the dyed cloths hidden beneath a floorboard, his fury was immediate. He accused them of rebellion, of plotting to send secret messages to the enemy.
The year was 1519, 66 years after Constantinople fell. The world had changed beyond recognition. Empires had risen, borders had shifted, and the name Byzantium had become a whisper, a memory buried under layers of new glory. But in a quiet Venetian workshop overlooking the Grand Canal, a young scholar bent over a faded scrap of cloth that should not have existed. His name was Luca di Rossi, son of the Venetian merchant Matteo di Rossi, the same man who had once traveled to Thessalonica under Ottoman rule. He had grown up listening to his father's stories of vanished convents, of women who sang to a god their conquerors forbade them to name. Most people dismissed those tales as fables, but Luca had found proof. The cloth before him was old, brittle with age, its color faded to ash gray. Yet faint traces of red and blue threads formed words, Greek words, written in the delicate curves of a woman's hand. He recognized one of them immediately, Theodora. The discovery consumed him. He knew what he held could not be ordinary. If genuine, it was the last voice of Byzantium's lost daughters, the women erased by conquest yet preserved by faith. And he would make the world remember them. Luca spent the next 3 years searching Venetian archives, monasteries, and trade manifests. He found fragments, shipping records, tax ledgers, letters, each one containing hints of something larger. A monk in Crete told him of merchants who smuggled religious relics from Ottoman lands. A scholar in Ragusa spoke of painted cloths that contained hidden messages. Every clue pointed east, back to the mountains above Thessalonica. In the spring of 1522, Luca left Venice on a small ship bound for the Aegean. He carried with him his father's old journal, a handful of coins, and the sacred scrap of cloth. It was his compass. The journey was perilous. Storms battered the ship, pirates stalked the coasts, and Ottoman patrols searched every port. But Luca pressed on, disguising himself as a trader in dyes and fabrics. In the silence of the sea, he often imagined the voices of the sisters whispering through the waves, fragments of prayers carried across time. When he finally reached Thessalonica, the city was unrecognizable. Minarets pierced the skyline where church domes once stood. The streets were alive with merchants speaking Turkish, Arabic, and Greek all at once. But beneath the noise, Luca sensed an older rhythm, a heartbeat that refused to die. He began his search in the hills to the west, asking about abandoned convents. Most locals shook their heads. Some laughed. "Those places are cursed," one farmer told him. "No one goes there. The earth itself has swallowed them." Still, Luca climbed higher each day, and on the seventh morning, as dawn broke over the Aegean, he saw it. A crumbling tower, half buried in ivy, its stone walls kissed by sunlight. The convent of the Theotokos.
It was the winter of 2024. In the mountains above Thessalonica, where wind carved its eternal song through the olive trees, a small team of archaeologists huddled around a shallow excavation trench. The air smelled of rain and ancient dust. They had been working for weeks, searching for the remnants of a convent long lost to legend, the convent of the Theotokos. For most of them, it was just another assignment, another site, another report. But for Dr. Eleni Markos, the lead historian, this was different. Her grandmother had told her stories of women who sang in defiance as empires fell, of a leader named Theodora whose prayers turned to whispers carried by wind. As a child, Eleni had believed those stories were fairy tales. But as an adult, she had found records, old, forgotten manuscripts in Venetian archives, citing a chronicle of ashes. Now she was standing exactly where that chronicle had been written 5 centuries earlier. On the morning of January 3rd, her team unearthed a section of stone wall. At first glance, it was nothing remarkable, another piece of Byzantine ruin. But then one of the interns called out, "Dr. Markos, there's writing here." Eleni dropped to her knees beside the wall, brushing away the soil with trembling fingers. The light caught faint lines carved into the stone, Greek letters, eroded but legible. She whispered them aloud, her voice catching. "What was destroyed in flesh lives in faith." Her hands froze. She had read those same words in the Venetian manuscript of the Chronicle of Ashes. Her heart pounded as she realized where she was standing. The wall was the inner chapel. The ground beneath her had once held the altar, the same place Sister Theodora had prayed before the soldiers came. That night, as the others slept, Eleni stayed behind. The mountains were silent except for the sigh of wind through broken arches. She set her lantern near the carved wall and opened her notebook. She began to read aloud from the surviving passages of the chronicle. "They took our voices, but not our prayers. They broke our bodies, but not our vows. They said our faith would fade like dust, but dust remembers the hands that shaped it." Her voice trembled as she continued. "And then,
From somewhere deep in the ruins, a faint sound echoed, soft, melodic, like a single note of a hymn. Eleni froze. The sound faded as quickly as it had come, but it was enough. For a moment, she felt as if the centuries between her and those women had collapsed into nothing. The air felt alive, trembling with presence.
2 days later, the team uncovered something else, a sealed clay jar buried beneath the chapel stones. Inside were fragments of fabric preserved by centuries of dryness and luck. Under magnification, faint traces of blue and crimson thread shimmered like veins of color. They formed letters, Greek again, but older, more delicate. The first line read, "The Chronicle of Theotokos continued." Eleni's breath caught in her throat. This was not Luca di Rossi's Venetian copy. This was original. A second line followed, "Written in exile, in silence, for those who will someday remember." Tears blurred her vision. For centuries, scholars had argued whether the chronicle had truly existed, or whether Luca had invented it as a moral allegory. Now, there was no doubt. The sisters had written their story in secret, buried it with their own hands, and trusted the earth to keep it safe. In the weeks that followed, the discovery made global headlines. Historians called it the Testament of Theodora. Religious leaders spoke of it as proof that faith endures through conquest. Museums offered millions for exclusive rights to exhibit the fragments. But for Eleni, it was never about fame. Each night, she returned alone to the chapel ruins, sitting in silence beneath the open sky. Sometimes, when the moonlight fell across the stones, she thought she saw shadows moving, figures kneeling, lips moving in prayer. She would close her eyes and whisper back, "I found you. The world remembers now." Months later, during restoration, the team uncovered one last surprise. Behind a section of plaster, hidden by centuries of soot, was a mural. It showed 12 women standing in a field of light. They were dressed in simple robes, their faces serene, their hands raised, not in fear, but in offering. And in the center, a figure with silver hair and eyes of quiet fire, Theodora. Beneath the painting, a single line of text gleamed faintly in gold leaf. "The body dies, but the song remains." News of the mural spread quickly. Pilgrims came from across Europe, standing in silence before the painting. Some wept. Others simply stood still, as if listening for something only they could hear. And in a way, they were right, because the sisters' hymn had survived. When experts restored the walls, they found tiny notations carved between the stones, fragments of ancient musical scales. When reconstructed, they formed a haunting melody, the hymn of Theotokos, believed to have been sung by the sisters before the fall. The piece became world famous. Choirs performed it in cathedrals, musicians recorded it, and every performance began the same way, with a single female voice, soft but unwavering, singing the first verse that had outlived empires. "Let the conquerors come, let the walls fall. What is built in faith cannot be undone." Years later, when Eleni was old and gray, she returned one last time to the convent ruins. The world had changed again. Satellites now circled the skies once ruled by stars, and empires had turned to nations. But the mountains remained the same, eternal and quiet. She walked slowly through the chapel, her cane tapping against the stone. Where the mural once stood, sunlight streamed through the cracks, scattering golden dust into the air. She sat down, closed her eyes, and began to hum the hymn. For a moment, she could hear them, the voices of Theodora and her sisters joining in harmony, as if the centuries had folded into one eternal song.
It was not imagination, it was memory, the kind that does not fade. That night, she passed away peacefully in her sleep. Her notebook lay open beside her. On the final page, in shaky handwriting, she had written, "They were never forgotten. They were only waiting to be heard." Decades later, the hymn of Theotokos was played during the reopening of Hagia Sophia as a museum of shared history, Christian, Islamic, human. The melody filled the great dome, echoing through marble and time. People of every faith stood together in silence, listening. And somewhere beyond the sound, beyond the walls and the centuries, the sisters of Byzantium smiled, not in triumph, not in sorrow, but in peace. Because their story, once buried in ashes, had become eternal light.